If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what was your scary/strange experience that made you want to believe in the paranormal, shadows, etc.? Years ago, I was sleeping with my fiancé at his mother's house. I woke up in the middle of the night with the weirdest feeling that someone was watching me. I scanned the room and noticed someone standing at the foot of the bed, on my fiancé's side. The figure was pitch black and featureless. I'm terrified, and I think, oh, I must be dreaming. Then I look over at my fiancé, and he's staring at it too. It was the most horrifying moment ever. Suddenly, fiancé sits up really quickly and aggressively. In that moment, the thing disappeared. Afterward, I wanted to dig a hole in the mattress and sleep under him. I found out later that pretty much everyone in his family has seen this thing, and they call it the shadow. It still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. That night was the most frightened I have ever been in my life. One time, when I was 8, I woke up around 4 a.m. I saw my mom walking up and down the hallway, so I decided to go out of my room and see what was up. She looked at me and went, "Hey, why aren't you asleep?" And then we had a little conversation about how I should go back to bed and stuff. Finally, she goes, "Okay, well, I'll fix you some food after I take a shower. Wait out here." So she went into the living room bathroom, and I sat on the small one-person couch next to the bathroom door. I eventually drifted to sleep again at the sound of the shower. The next morning, I wake up to someone shaking me. It was my mom. She goes, "Green Mask, what are you doing out here and not in your room?" I go, "You told me to wait here." She goes, "No, I didn't. I just woke up." I was like, "Well, I heard you take a shower." She immediately opened up the bathroom and checked every corner of the house. There was no sign of entry or anything. I started crying out of fear. Honestly, it was probably my mind playing tricks, but it really made me question my ducking sanity. I understand if it was a dream and I was in bed. But I ducking woke up, had a full-fledged conversation, and found myself in the living room. I've never had it happen again. This was like 14 years ago. My friend told me she had been having really bad nightmares and couldn't sleep, and she asked me to stay the night. I did, but I never fell asleep for more than a minute or so at a time. Something woke me up, and as I opened my eyes, I saw a completely black creature the size and approximate shape of a mountain lion silently crawl out of the closet and to the end of the bed. It then reached its paw up onto the bed, almost as if feeling for whoever was on the bed. I definitely didn't sleep that night. The next day, I convinced myself that I was half asleep and dreaming, which I have been known to do, even with my eyes open. I jokingly asked my friend if her nightmare was about a pitch-black demon cat. The blood drained from her face, and she got wide-eyed and started shaking. She told me that was exactly what it was and that it wasn't a nightmare. It would come right before she fell asleep and lay on the bed, snarling whenever she moved. She had never described it to me before that day. Okay, no joke. As a child, 2 to 3 years old, I played a lot by myself. Usually in the hallway between my mother's room and the bathroom. My mother was so surprised by my linguistic abilities. I was talking so well, but what freaked her out was that she would hear me say a word wrong and then say, "Oh, okay," then correct myself. When we went to the video store, I always wanted to watch Crocodile Dundee. My family made fun of it, saying that I had a thing for accents and was born to live in Australia. You know, just joking around with each other. One day, my mom had enough of that movie and asked me why I loved it so much. I told her, they were like the man in the bathtub. My mother freaked out. You see, our apartment building was an old, converted Victorian. Our bathroom was one of the first installed in our town, and the original tub was claw-footed, abnormally long, and always icy cold. When my mother moved in, she made the comment that it was big enough to float in. The manager said it had been a custom-made tub for the owner, who had been quite tall. The original owner was Australian. I explained that he sat in the tub, and we talked. My mother made me play in the living room only. We moved out as soon as the lease ended. I grew up in a house that was built in 1880. I remember as a kid seeing a young girl walk around the house late at night. I have sisters, but they were both in bed. The weird part was that it wasn't scary at all. My mom later told me that one of my sisters had seen the girl and asked my mom to stop her from walking through the house because she was keeping her awake. It turns out my mom had noticed her too, but she was shocked that my sister had seen her. All three of us saw her independently, before we had ever talked about it. Later on, I asked my mom about a man who walks through the house. I had only heard him once, I didn't see him, but I knew that he was a man. He had really heavy steps, and he terrified me. He felt evil. I asked about him, assuming it was a childhood dream, and I wanted to make sure of that. My mom cut me off mid-sentence. She didn't want to talk about him. He scared her too. Now, I'm skeptical as hell. I don't see ghosts everywhere. My childhood home is the only place I've experienced this. I think there's a scientific explanation, like a non-linear experience of time or something. But still, it seems supernatural, given that there's currently no way to explain it. I have a few. The first would be when my brother, mom, and I were home and kept having the radio in the garage turn on randomly. One day we were all up with it turning on and went out there and unplugged it. All three of us were standing there, and the button was pushed in and began to play. We ran out so fast and didn't mess with it until my dad came home. He would never believe us, even to this day. The other would be when my aunt was visiting around 2009. She came to our house, which she hadn't been to in almost 20 years since she helped us move. I had woken up for breakfast and walked into the kitchen. My mom, brother, aunt, and dad were all in there. We were just enjoying each other's company. My brother and I had let my aunt stay in our room while she was here so she could have a bed and we could get the living room. Out of nowhere, my aunt says, "Can I ask you guys a question? Have you ever seen a woman in a white dress standing in your closet just watching you?" My brother and my mom completely dropped their food, and I just looked at her wide-eyed. For the longest time, me and my brother had seen this woman, and all she would do was stand in our closet and never move or anything. We never closed it because she never bothered us. To this day, I wish I could ask her more about what she saw. Since then, my parents have remodeled their entire house, and my mom hasn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. When I was around 20 years old, I lived with my best friend in an apartment. I had been seeing what looked like a black figure that was either really tall or was clinging against the living room corner and sticking its head straight out at a 90 degrees angle. I never spoke about it, and I know I didn't because I was a big believer that you could speak things into existence. Scared of ghosts? Talk about being scared of ghosts. You'll see a ghost. Anyway, I saw it quite frequently, never head on. Always at the corner of my eye, but in the exact same place in the exact same position. There's nothing that could have caused the illusion of there being something there. It was an intersecting wall that ended in the corner of the hallway that only had doors in it, and directly behind where I would see it was the bathroom, but we always keep the bathroom door closed. Nothing but a dark hallway. My friend and I were in the living room just talking, and she looked at me and said, "I have to tell you something. I keep seeing this thing in the hallway." I didn't even let her finish. I started pointing exactly where it was, almost shouting, "Right there." We talk about that every so often, and I haven't seen anything like that since we moved. It was so freaking eerie that we saw the exact same human-shaped black void in the exact same place and in the exact same way. Never having talked about it before. As a child, I was hugely into ghost stories and mysteries. I would always ask my family members about their paranormal experiences. My dad and I were never really close until recently. Once every year, me, my dad, and my stepmom would go to Kentucky to see my dad's side of the family since we lived 12 hours away from them. My grandma is very fond of dolls and toys from the late 1800s into the early 90s. We used to sleep in the very back room of her house. In the room, she has glass porcelain dolls on top of a large wooden dresser. My parents slept on the bed on the other side of the room, and I slept on a cot right under the dresser. The first night we slept there, I got a very uneasy feeling when I would look at the dolls, like something was watching me. I obviously didn't pay much attention at the time since I was 8 to 9, maybe 10. I realized that the feeling got worse when it was nighttime and I was trying to sleep. I could feel their eyes on me, and I hated it. It was so cold around the area where I slept, and the floors would creak and then stop at the foot of my cot. Sometimes I think the dolls would move around. Now, when we visit, we sleep in a camper right outside of their house. I got a new dog, and she's extremely sensitive. The house I was living in at the time had a strange energy, and a friend of mine swore it was haunted. One night, I was sitting in my bed, and my new dog was staring up into the ceiling corner above my bed and visibly shaking. She then ran out of my room and slept in my clothes hamper in the laundry room. No matter what I did or how many times I brought her back, she was looking at the ceiling and wouldn't stay. I don't live there anymore, but still, to this day, she always seems to be looking at things that I can't see. Whatever was in my room that night, she was not a fan. I smudged the F out of my house after that. I was helping move my cousin out of her dorm at SCAD in Savannah, Georgia. She and my aunt left to run stuff to the storage unit and grab lunch. I decided just to keep working, cleaning the bathroom, and finishing up. The girls had their beds bunked, and we were going to return the pins at checkout, so they were laying on the dresser in a line. I was scrubbing the sink when I heard one of the pins hit the floor with a loud ping. I looked over my shoulder, saw it on the floor, went over, and put it back with the others. I started scrubbing the sink again, and not a minute later, ping! A pin was on the floor again. So, I went over, put it back on the dresser, and moved them all vertically so they couldn't roll off in that direction again. I walked back to the sink, and the second I grabbed the sponge, ping! And the whole room felt like it had turned down 10 degrees. All the hair on the back of my neck and arms stood up. I walked back, grabbed the pin off the floor, picked up the other pins, and put all of them in a cup. I turned around to go back to the sink, and after about 2 steps, ping! And I swear, on my mother's grave, I heard someone giggle directly behind me. I turned around, and sure enough, there was a pin from the cup on the floor. About then, my aunt and cousin came in, and my aunt said, "What's wrong? You look white as a sheet." Y'all, I believe that. I'd had sort of similar experiences before then, but after that, there wasn't any doubt. When I was 11 years old, I woke up one night and saw a man standing in my room, opening and closing my dresser drawers. He was tall, pale, and shiny, but he looked corporeal, not translucent, ghostly, or anything. I couldn't move at all, but I pissed myself instantly. I shut my eyes as tight as I could, but when I opened them, he was still there, opening and closing drawers. I kept my eyes closed for a long time, and finally, after what seemed like hours, he was gone. The next morning, a lot of my shirts and pants were tied in knots. I came to the conclusion that I had a very vivid dream, and perhaps my sister played a joke on me by tying my clothes in knots. Flash forward 15 years. We had long since moved out of the house, and no one had lived there since. I stopped by one day with my mom and 2 aunts, who had lived in the same house when they were kids. When we walked into my bedroom, my mom and my older aunt started teasing my younger aunt about the silver man she saw one time. My jaw hit the ducking floor. I studied abroad in Italy my junior year of college and lived at this old castle. The students stayed in what is affectionately called the Croft. Every night we would hear noises, like someone walking, but we would just assume it was the old wood creaking or somebody going to use the restroom. One weekend, the whole group, except me and 2 others, decided to go to Milan for the weekend. Well, one evening, as I lay in bed reading a book and waiting for my friend to get back from the library, I distinctly heard the sound of the Croft door open and close. I then heard halting steps on the stairs. These were not subtle creaks but obvious footsteps, so I assumed it was my friend or his girlfriend coming back, so of course I thought nothing of it. Then the steps began to sound closer and closer to my door, but I heard no voices, and an unexpected chill crawled down my spine. I felt nervous, so I yelled, "Is that you, Dave?" The steps stopped outside my door, but again, no one spoke. I was starting to become terrified when I heard my friend and his girlfriend walking down the path outside, and I immediately stuck my head out my window, called out to them, and asked who was in the Croft. They replied that no one but me was in there. I did not even hesitate. I jumped out of my window, and the moment I was out, I heard the door to my room slam open and heard what I can only describe as a whispered scream of rage. No one in the group ever believed me, but I asked the castle's cook about it, and she explained that there were ghosts in the Croft, 3 in fact. One little girl that liked to play pranks, one weeping woman, and one malicious man with a hate for the living. My house growing up was built in the 1920s. While I can think of several things that can be explained by other things, such as sleep paralysis, childlike imagination, creaky pipes, and bad wiring, there are some things that have left me and my family members unsettled. I generally think most hauntings can be explained by natural phenomena, and I'm happy to think this could be the case too. From the moment we moved into the house, I was 6, I absolutely hated my closet. I would cry if my parents didn't close it at night. This fear never went away, even when I was a teenager. I always had to have it closed or covered up. I can't explain exactly how genuinely terrifying this feeling was, but I always felt watched. My whole family was creeped out by that closet too and generally avoided it. The upstairs was small and had a landing surrounded by our 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. I would wake up with this oddly unsettled feeling and walk to the landing and stare down into the darkness of the stairs, which was odd as normally if I had to go to the bathroom I would sprint there and back. A few times I would find my brother already standing there but looking up at our attic door instead, and I'd have a heart attack. The weirdest thing for me was that several times someone in my family heard a voice that sounded like one of us, but we weren't there. There were at least 2 times my dad came into my room, annoyed at me for waking him up when I was deep asleep and completely tangled in my bed sheets. He told me that I tapped him hard on the shoulder and very clearly told him to get up and that I needed help, but when he opened his eyes, I wasn't there, and he had to search for me. My brother told me about times he heard me talking in a room, but when he checked, I wasn't even upstairs. It still gives me chills to think about it. There were also times I clearly heard the door open and my mom come home and call my brother and me, but when we got downstairs, no one was home. It would be really odd, and we'd both definitely heard it, even with headphones in. Sometimes we'd leave the house because we'd be so freaked out by it. There are other odd stories of things going completely missing and us finding them in odd places months later, but I've always just put that down as forgetting where we put them or our cats hiding things. Some of my friends refused to come over after sleeping the night, but they wouldn't tell me anything other than that the place really creeped them out. When I was 11, I was staying with some friends at their cabin deep in the woods, in the middle of rural nowhere, like literally not another house for miles. We were playing soccer, and my friend yelled and pointed to the trees behind the yard, and we all saw a man standing there in a dirty brown shirt and jeans who walked towards us and vanished behind a tree. We screamed for their dad, and he came running out to see what was wrong and told us to go inside while he looked around. He found nothing, but we didn't want to go outside and play again. Later that night, we had pretty much calmed down and were watching TV in their living room, which had big glass sliding doors facing the forest, when their dog started growling and barking at something outside the glass doors. He hadn't acted like this before, so we called their dad again, and he went outside through the doors and found nothing again, but the dog wouldn't stop barking until a few minutes later. I have no idea what the duck we saw, but I never went up with them again. I remember it so clearly. When I was younger, we lived in a ranch-style house, meaning a long hallway with rooms on either side. My room was at the end of the hall on the left, and the master was at the end on the right. The end of the hallway was also the exterior wall of the house. My parents had a small TV in their room that they would leave on while they fell asleep. If it was still on and they were asleep, I would sneak in there, lay under their bed with my dog, and watch reruns of Dragnet. This was usually on at the time I snuck over. One night, my dog and I were lying under the bed, and the hall began to glow with a pale green light. The light kept getting stronger and brighter. As I'm seeing this light, the hair on my dog's neck and back starts to raise, and he gets into an aggressive posture. However, he does not make a sound. He was always very protective of me. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a shadowy, illuminated green person slowly walk by the door. Followed by a smaller person, and then a third smaller person, all adult size. All three are looking straight ahead and walking like they've got somewhere to go. Now, mind you, the hallway ended maybe 18 inches past the edge of the door frame and was also the exterior wall of the house. Right after the third one is past the door frame, the light in the hall is gone, and there is a dim green light coming from the yard. I jumped out from under the bed and jumped in a recliner to look out the window and watch the three figures continue to walk through our side yard and up the hill into the woods. If there was a door where they exited, it would have been on the second story. There is no deck, no window, just the side of the house. When I was about 10, the family moved into an older house built in the late 1970s. A few days after we moved in and were settling in, my parents went out with some friends and left me and my little sister for about an hour. Well, bedtime rolled around, and I snuggled into bed, knowing my parents would be home soon and all would be well. As I was laying there, adjusting to my new room and trying to fall asleep, my closed door jiggled open, and then a clear sound of the door being pushed inwards happened. Thinking it was my little sister, I looked over just as the door swung in all the way, and a figure as tall as the doorframe and wide enough to fill it stood there, dark and ominous and staring. Now my parents are tall, but not that tall, and there was no way it could have been them, as they are slim folk, and I would hear them coming in since my room was right next to the wooden staircase heading to the front door, and it was also directly over the garage with one rattling old garage door. It was so eerily quiet as I stared at the looming figure. I could see that behind the figure, my sister's door was also wide open, when it should have been slightly cracked. That door was hard to push since it dragged on the carpet, so there was no way it could have swung in on its own, and I was the one who had nearly closed it for her. I was too terrified and tired to really do anything or question what was happening. I decided it was best to just close my eyes, fall asleep, and pretend like I didn't see the figure in the first place. All of me and my friends when we were in our teens lived in the same area. And our parents, uncles, aunts, and basically all of the older people in our families grew up in this area too. We've been living in this neighborhood for a while now. And we'd all experienced some weird shit like seeing a man at the school late at night 1 second, and when we all looked back, not even 10 seconds, he was gone. We looked for him for like half an hour, and there's no way he could have possibly evaded us without leaving, and we would have heard his car and seen him. He was gone in an instant. There's also some old hazelnut orchards that basically fill up most of the area. And the street lanes in these areas were built in the 1960s. But anyway, We usually have to walk through or by these orchards to get to and from each other's houses. And at one time or another, something has happened to all of us. We've been pushed, scratched, and bit, and a couple times we've heard little kids. The scariest time, however, was when we saw a tall figure in the distance just staring at us. We stopped walking towards him, and he made a howling noise and started barreling towards us. And we took off, running into the orchards. We looked back, and he was gone. Just like that. I came to find out recently that back in the early 80s, a cult used to sacrifice people up there. We'd all been told this story by different family members, but we all just thought they were trying to scare us. And that was just a few things that have happened. I was 8 years old, in my 50s now, and staying overnight at a neighbor's home. I was sleeping on the carpeted floor of a finished basement, and there was a chair in the room about 4 feet behind me. I woke up suddenly and turned over to face the chair, which was now on its side on the floor. There was a woman kneeling behind the chair with her arm on the side of it and her chin resting on her arm. She had long, dark, straight hair and was obviously sitting there watching me sleep. I thought it was the woman who lived there. When our eyes met, she let out a sigh, and I mimicked her sigh. Her lid lifted, and then her entire body floated up and into the ceiling and disappeared. I fell back asleep, and in the morning, the chair was still on its side. It had been upright when I went to sleep originally. That was it, but no one could ever convince me this didn't happen. No one can convince me there are things we just don't understand out there. That is all. When I was younger, I would often hear whispers or voices calling my name at night. One night when I was about 10 years old, it was extremely windy outside. The wind seemed to be moving all throughout the house. However, the wind started to eerily sound like moans. That's when I shot up from bed and looked at the clock. 3 a.m. I quickly ran off to my mom's room and asked if I could spend the night there. Once I got settled, I heard a creak in the floorboards. The only thing that illuminated that entire room was a small clock on the cable box directly across the bed. I had glanced over at the clock, 3:06 a.m. When staring at the clock, I felt this feeling of dread come over me. It was then that a very tall shadow of a man passed by the clock, completely blocking the light for a brief moment. I instantly started to tell my mom what I just saw. She just told me to calm down and pray. That night, I prayed over and over again until the sun came out. I grew up always thinking that my mind somehow played tricks on me that night. However, it was only 10 years later that I brought up that story to my mom. What I didn't know was that she had seen the same exact thing. The only difference is that she felt the same man breathing on her face, as I was freaking out and telling her what I just saw. Props to her for standing her ground and not letting whatever showed up control her feelings. If it were up to me, I would have peeled tires out of there. I had a few spooky instances at my childhood home. The main one was that when I came home from school, I was about 12, I stood at our telephone table to see if I'd had any mail. A dark shadow appeared behind me, which I saw out of the corner of my eye. I assumed it was my sister acting stupid. I turned around to speak to her, but she wasn't there, and the shadow had disappeared. I called out to her, and she shouted to me from her bedroom upstairs. There's no way she could get there in less than a second. At that house, I've heard footsteps on the floor above me while I was alone, which walked from one side of the house to the other through a solid wall. And on several occasions, I heard what seemed like a party happening downstairs, while I was upstairs, but when I walked into the room, no one was there, and the whole house was instantly silent. I never felt afraid there, though, so if it was something supernatural, I don't think it wished us any harm. I actually said goodbye to it before I left. I also have memories of what I think could be how I died in a past life. When I was about 14, these memories just became a part of my everyday thoughts. They weren't dreams. Both my mom and sister have these kinds of memories too. I'm still not sure I believe in the paranormal and am aware that what I experienced could be explained away, but it didn't feel at all natural at the time. My whole life, I've been fascinated with the idea of ghosts, but I've never been able to convince myself they were real until one day, when I was 18. My best friend from college went to stay at her dad's house in Leicester for a couple of days. He lived on the countryside outside of the city in a cottage. It was a really small town, they didn't even have shops. We'd been there for a few nights, and everything was fine until the last night. We were both sharing a bed in the spare room. It was late, but we were up chatting, and we both heard the loudest crash. It sounded like all of the dishes in the kitchen had fallen out of the cupboards. We both heard it and looked at each other, completely frozen. We tried to convince ourselves it was something like the dishwasher, but we couldn't relax, so we went to wake her dad up. To be honest, we were amazed, no one else had heard it. She had a younger sister, about 8, too. He got up, and we all went downstairs. Absolutely nothing. The kitchen was fine, the dishes were fine, not a thing wrong in the house, but it didn't make sense because it was such a loud crash. We go back to bed and convince ourselves that we made it up or that we must be exaggerating. About 15 minutes later, when her dad had fallen back asleep, we were both laying in bed wide awake but trying to sleep when we heard noises in the hallway. It sounded like somebody was just walking around, but we could see under the door that no lights were on, and we could hear her dad snoring. Our room was next to the bathroom too, and we could hear that somebody hadn't just gotten up to use the toilet. We're both absolutely petrified and convince each other we need to open the door and see. We both grabbed weapons. I think I had a can of hairspray and she had the lamp. As we both went to open the door, we heard somebody whisper stop and, I swear to God, I nearly passed out. We both heard it at the exact same time because we turned to look at each other in shock. We both hid under the blankets all night till it got light out and just slept on the drive home. I'm 26 now, and I still think about it. I've never had an experience like that since, and I still don't know what to make of it. My girlfriend lives about 30 to 45 minutes from me. There is a motorway I take all the way there and to also get home. I used to stay around her place anywhere from 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. before heading home. One night, heading home, I was driving in the right lane, listening to music, singing out loud, and feeling especially good on this night. On the motorway, there is a bend to the right with a strip of forest on the side. All of a sudden I hear this voice, and this is not my voice, say to me in my head, be careful, there is a deer on the right. Without thinking, I just go oh yeah and start getting into the left lane, so I cannot be on the right side where the deer is. After getting in the left lane, I snap back to reality and think, why the duck did I just do that, and what was that voice? At this point, I hit the bend, and there on the right is an 8-point buck standing tall. I freak out internally, and ever since I have had this odd feeling taking that turnout night. The first experience I remember was when I was 9. I was staying the night in a very old house, built in 1735, and I had to go pee in the early hours of the morning. I got lost on the way back to the room I was sleeping in and was crying in a hallway. A woman dressed in a gray flowy nightgown and robes came around the corner and beckoned to me to follow her. She didn't say anything, but she led me back to the room and watched me go inside. I realized I'd forgotten to say thank you and stuck my head out of the door, but she was gone. In the morning, I asked one of the adults who the lady was so I could say thank you, and he asked me some questions about what she looked like and said, I think you met the lady, and explained that she had died in a fire over 100 years ago. He took me to see a painting of her, and it did seem to be the same lady. She was absolutely not anyone staying at the house that night. There were only 4 adults there, and she didn't look like any of them. I've been fortunate enough to have many more experiences in the years since. There was always weird stuff going on in a house I used to live in. Things falling over, seeing shit, etc. My brother always talked about there being a dark presence that would mess with him. Both he and my sister had horrible night terrors in that house. My brother also talked about a white presence that was there to protect us. One night, we got the bright idea to do some amateur EVP work. So we turned off anything that made a noise and spent the night going room to room, asking questions, and sitting in silence. The next day, when we were reviewing it, we definitely found some weird stuff. There were men and women in some of them. The man was definitely the evil one, with the woman the light. The scariest one was when my brother asked a question. The woman said, I won't let you have my sister, my brothers, and my name, to which there was a kind of low growl after that. A lot of strange things happened in that house. When I was very young, I could see a shadowy figure walking around in the house when it walked into the hallway in front of my room. It freaked me out, so I asked my parents if I could close the door at night. I blamed the cats for disturbing my sleep, true, and they allowed me to keep the door closed. I could still hear it walking at night, and I continued to hear it for many years afterwards. The shadow was very tall, a bit higher than 6 feet, I would say. It was wide and made heavy footsteps. It also breathed loudly. I grew up hearing tales of Wendigo from my grandmother, and to this day, that's the closest thing that it resembles. It didn't seem able to go through doorways where the door was closed or partially closed. Much like a vampire, it could not enter places that it was not invited into. It once tried to open my door repeatedly for several hours about a year ago but didn't succeed. I never talked about the shadow to anyone, but a few months ago, my sister mentioned that when she was very young, she could hear a strange set of footsteps moving around the house. It gave off a presence that scared her very much. Even when she was older, she could still feel her presence. She called it the Ant King after a boss in Bugdom who frightened her. I talked to my dad a bit later, and he reluctantly admitted that sometimes at night he thinks there's something else in the house and it's dangerous to get up. But the whole family experiencing the exact same malevolent presence on the same nights makes me wonder if there really is some kind of truth in some of the things I see. My family and I lived in many of the smaller suburban towns surrounding Buffalo, New York. One evening, we were visiting a friend from church in one of the more heavily wooded towns. A small group of women from our church liked to gather for a little get-together. I, being about 13, was happy to watch the two younger children, a 5-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. The upstairs was narrow and had 2 rooms, a playroom and a little girl's room. The playroom didn't have a door on it, so the parents could hear what was going on downstairs. The playroom was packed with toys, and we had a blast playing. No spooky vibes, just princess tutus and a delicious pretend Play-Doh meal made by the little ones. I remember standing up and going to get a game from a shelf by the door. The kids were standing facing the doorway, and I turned to them with my back to the doorway. The little boy started grabbing for the girl's hand, and the color vanished from their faces. The little girl's eyes went so wide that you could see veins and wrinkles forming around them. I asked what on earth was wrong, and the little boy just pointed over my shoulder. Whatever it was not good. I spun around, and inches from my face was this horrible black mass. It took up the entirety of the doorway. It was thick, tall, and dense. It was so dark that the light from the room around it seemed dim. It was humanoid. It had something like a head and shoulders with 2 thick, long arms that covered the entirety of its body. The only thing that wasn't black was a large, glowing red orb in the middle of where its head and neck would be. I felt absolute dread. It was radiating this energy that made me want to vomit. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to protect the little ones. I remember shutting my eyes tight, reaching back, grabbing their shirts, and just tackling through this thing. I don't know if we passed through it or not. At this point, they were sobbing, and all I could hear was my heartbeat hammering in my head. When we passed through the doorway, I remember feeling an intense wave of anger and sorrow. At the time, I remember it feeling like a mix of the passing of a pet and an incident with a school bully. As an adult, I'm chalking it up to fight or flight. I didn't want to spook the religious parents, so I said we were disturbed by a noise outside, and the mom thought it was foxes. I told my mother later on what happened, and we never went to that meetup again. To this day, I've never seen a shadow figure or anything like that. When I was little, I was at the house of one of my mom's friends from church. I was playing in one of the upstairs bedrooms. This room was sort of creepy because it had a little door that opened up into an attic space. The attic space was narrow and went back a ways. It had exposed studs and insulation and was used for storage. I remember hearing something moving around in the attic space, so I opened the little door, but it was very dark, and I didn't see anything in there, so I closed it. As soon as the door shut, I heard loud scratching sounds from behind the door, and it gave me the chills. So once again, I opened the door and was immediately shocked because there was now a light on in there, a light bulb that hung from the ceiling with a pull chain to turn it on and off, and the light bulb was swinging back and forth. I felt panic, and I turned around to leave when I saw something that froze me in my tracks. In the bedroom, I saw the shadow of a very tall, skinny man standing a foot from me on the wall next to the attic door. The silhouette looked like he was wearing a full-length robe. It went almost down to the feet. On his head was what looked like a fez hat. The shadow walked across the walls around the room and went out the door. I was driving home from work. I used to work at a restaurant, so it was late at night, 11 p.m.ish, by the time I got out. I lived in the country. It was very hilly to get home, and there were lots of corn fields. I was driving up a hill with a corn field to the right, and beyond that were hiking trails and a reservoir. Approaching a twisty road sign, I suddenly saw a large black shadow pass in front of it. It was a very crisp shape, and at the height of the sign, it appeared like the creature's waist and arms passed in front of it. It appeared like the swinging of arms like upright walking on 2 legs. Though, because it was nighttime, my car lights were only shown on the sign and the black creature that passed in front of it. I instantly slowed down and was like, what the heck did I just see? Now, I have a creature for the area I used to live in, Central New York, that I've named Stickman. Ever stand next to one of those signs? It's really tall, and imagine that the sign was only about half the height of the creature. I'm kind of hoping it's like a tree from Tolkien's stories and peaceful. But you never know. I know people don't believe in spirits. I myself never did until I lived in this one house. It was a newer home too, so it was odd to me. Perhaps it was just energy left over from a time long ago, I don't know. But my entire family saw stuff. It first started out with noises. The first summer there, my sister and I were left alone all day while my parents worked. We were 15 and 10 at the time, and one day I heard coughing in my parents' room. My sister and I thought it was our father. We thought maybe he was sick at home. So all day we kept hearing coughing, And finally, after about 5 hours, I decided to peek in and ask Dad if he needed medicine. There was no one in the room. We went in to check the master bathroom, and no one was there. Then, a few days later, we heard the back shower open. It was one of those rolling kinds that made quite a bit of noise. We heard it open and close, and we sat there waiting for my mom or Dad to come out of the room. Again, nothing, they were not home. That summer, my cousins visited, and they too heard the coughing and showering. We lived there for 5 years, and things got worse and worse over time. Tapping on the walls, my sister and her best friend were having a sleepover, and her friend saw someone walk out of my room. She said hi to me, but it wasn't me. My cousin saw someone walk out of the bathroom into my sister's room. She thought it was me, but I was out front at the time. My aunt stayed over on New Year's Eve once. She witched me and my sister out for walking all over her air bed and waking her up. We did not do that. My mother was walking down the hallway in the early morning. She thought my dad was behind her and asked if he wanted a full or half pot of coffee. When she got out of the hallway, she turned to see a man in a plaid shirt who then ran past her. My sister's friend stopped coming over because she was in my sister's room, and a Susan B. Anthony coin my grandpa had given her flew off the shelf and hit the wall, leaving a dent in the wall. My sister was walking out the door at the time and thought it was her friend who threw it. She had been on the top bunk, sitting down. Her friend got up and called her mom to leave right away, but she never came back over. My best friend stayed over once for a week, and she stayed in my room with her evil cat that hated me. I slept on the bottom bunk of my sister's bed. My friend asked why I kept coming into the room to bug the cat. Why I kept knocking on the walls, and why I would lay on the bed only to get up and leave. I did none of this. That cat hated me and would attack me. She said the cat would flip out, hiss, and meow like I was in the room. Then one time I got up to go pee in the middle of the night in our bathroom the way the mirror was. If you looked over your right shoulder while on the toilet, you could see into the kitchen. I always did this when I left the door open. It was like 3 a.m., so the door was left open, and I looked in the mirror. I saw a man standing in the kitchen by the fridge. At first, I thought it was my dad. Then he turned around like he knew I was looking, and there were no eyes, just dark patches, and he opened his mouth, perhaps to say something I didn't know. I stopped mid-pee and ran back into my room. All the while keeping an eye on the guy. I never peed at night again. I was so happy when we moved. I have no clue what all that was, but so many people witnessed and saw things that it wasn't just my imagination. When I was in the 3rd grade, I lived in a 2-story house in Central California. It was a typical tract home neighborhood built sometime in the early 90s. All the bedrooms are on the 2nd floor. There was a big landing at the top of the stairs and doors all around to the bedrooms. I was directly to the right of the stairs, so I heard people walking up and down frequently. I was always a little psychic as a kid, but living in that house solidified that for me. One night I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. My first thought was that my stepdad was up getting water. I was really thirsty, so I jumped up and went to my door to quickly ask him to bring me a glass. As I got to the door, I noticed that no lights were on outside of my bedroom, and my parents' bedroom door was open. I could see that they were both asleep in their beds. I immediately felt like I was being watched and ran to my bed for safety. The footsteps persisted every day after that for months, and I was utterly terrified. It was like someone was walking circles on the landing in front of everyone's rooms. I told my mom about it, but she brushed me off and told me I was being dramatic. It was just my imagination. I finally confided in my grandmother, who was more open-minded, and she explained that if I ask them to go away and to stop, they will. One night I worked up enough courage to get out of bed and tell whoever that was to please stop and leave me alone, that they were scaring me. I literally stood in the hallway with footsteps walking by as I stated all of that out loud to the unseen specter. Immediately after I said that, the footsteps stopped and never returned. It was such a traumatic and bizarre turn of events that, to this day, it still creeps me out. I think I was 3 or 4 years old when this happened, almost 4 decades ago. I was playing a toy truck on our dining table when suddenly, everything became brighter, and I felt an urge to look up. When I looked up, I saw 2 people, a man and a woman, looking down at me and smiling. Their physical features are Western-like, I'm Asian, BTW, and they were wearing white ancient Greek/Roman-like clothes with gold trimmings. They were talking to me, but I could not hear them. Their proportions are big, they look like huge people with very beautiful faces. I don't know how long it lasted, and then they waved at me, and then they disappeared, and everything went back to normal. The brightness of the surroundings disappeared too. I don't know how to describe the experience, but it was like the entire ceiling of my house became a huge TV screen where I could see them. It only happened once, though, Or perhaps I only remember it happening once in my life. All my parents, aunts, and uncles who lived in that house all have stories about seeing me talking to someone they couldn't see, and they also said that sometimes they saw me walking around the house as if someone were holding my hand. They got so scared to the point that they had to call a local faith healer, witch doctor, to drive away whatever they thought was talking to me. To be honest, I don't remember talking to anyone they could not see or having an imaginary friend. I'm a bit bothered every time I remember this, not because I'm scared but rather because I'm just curious to know more about it. To be honest, I don't know if I 100% believe in supernatural or paranormal stuff, but I try my best to keep an open mind about things that I don't understand. When I was 6, my cousins and I were home alone at their house. They were like 15 and 25. I wanted to play hide and seek, and so did the 15-year-old. It took a bit of convincing to get the 25-year-old to play, but eventually she gave in. She counted while I and the 15-year-old hid. She dove into the kitchen while I ran upstairs into the closet at the end of the hall. I hid behind a long black dress and waited. Soon I heard the 25-year-old yell that she was searching. Suddenly, I felt warmth on my neck and heard breathing. I at first thought it was the 15-year-old, but then I realized I was against the wall and she was downstairs. I remember throwing myself out of the closet and screaming. I turned around to see a figure duck behind the wall next to the door. The 25-year-old came running upstairs with the 15-year-old right behind her. I saw the color in the 5-year-old's face drain as she stared behind me. I looked back and didn't see anything. I faced her again, which seemed to snap her out of it. All she said was, "I found you." I remember thinking, WTF? You found me? Nah. I declared that I didn't want to play anymore. When I was 13, I remembered this and pulled her aside at a family party. I asked what she saw that night. At first, she tried to play dumb and said, "Which night?" I rolled my eyes and told her she knew what I was talking about. She told me that when she got up the stairs, she first saw me looking at her. Then she looked up at the closet and saw a very tall man smiling and waving at her. She froze, and it dipped out of sight when I turned around. That's the first time that I can personally remember not being able to explain something. I was driving with a friend from Vancouver to Nevada. It was about 2 a.m. when we were driving through the long, windy roads of the Oregon trails, and we decided to stop to rest. First, in our car, which was extremely uncomfortable, we decided to walk into the woods, like 20 feet away from the car, and set up a hammock. I fell asleep instantly into a dream where I was in an all-white room and I saw a witch standing very far from me, and when I blinked, she appeared right up close, face to face with me, and she said, "You need to leave right now." Of course, this woke me up, and I brushed it off as a dream, so I fell back asleep, only to be back in the same dream with her yelling at me to leave. I woke up again and told my buddy that maybe we should just keep driving. He said to try to sleep one more time. This time I couldn't sleep, and I kept hearing in my head her voice, "Leave, you're not welcome here, it's unsafe for you," with flashes of what she looked like. I woke my friend up, and we left immediately. I swear it kept me up all night enough to drive safely. I then looked up the history of the area we stopped at, and there were tons of haunting stories from the Oregon trails. My family is from Brazil, and there are a lot of spiritual and superstitious beliefs there. My own workplace experience was working at a bar in an old part of Toronto. The land in this whole neighborhood was originally used as a base when the British Army was at war with the USA. So the bar had an office in the basement, and to get to the basement, you had to go down a creaky, steep stairwell. As you can imagine, it was incredibly creepy. Only the owner had a key to the office, and even when he wasn't there, you could see the light of the office through the bottom door slat and a shadow walking back and forth in the room. On night I was closing the bar with a coworker, and we could hear moving and bumping in the basement. We knew we were the only ones there because we cleared the basement before closing. So the sounds get more frequent, and we decide to get out of there. As we're walking to the back door to lock up, we hear someone running up the basement stairs. My colleagues push me out the door and lock it behind me, and we get the hell out of there. Anyone who had to work overnight at that place reported feeling someone watching them. All my life, I've had a thing about basements too. The basement in my parents' house scared me when I was younger. Up until about my 20s, I could not stand to be in that basement alone because I always felt like something was watching me. What really cemented my belief, though, was that when I was about 12 or 13, I think, I was home with one of my sisters, my dad, and our friend from next door. My sister, my friend, and I were down in the basement playing a game because we were being loud and annoying to my dad, as teenage girls are known to be. My dad had some errands to run, so he told us he was going to leave and would be back. We kept playing our game after he left, and, after a few minutes, we noticed the sounds of water running and the sound of footsteps. We figured that my dad was home and didn't think anything of it. But he never called down to tell us he was back, as he always did when we, my sisters and I, lived there, so I decided to go upstairs to see if it was him. So up I went, and what do you know? There's no water running, and there's no one on the upper floor. Now, my dad has a very distinct way of walking and, at the time, always wore steel-toed boots, which are also very distinct on a wooden floor. I don't know what my sister and friend heard, but I had heard those steel-toed boots. Well, I went back downstairs and told my sister and friend, and we all decided that we were not going to leave the basement until we were absolutely sure that he was home. I was about 6 and was at my cousin's house. It was just my cousin Danny, who was 15 at the time, and Ally, who was 25. I, being 6, wanted to play hide and seek in a big house. The house was 2 stories and ducking huge. Danny was all for this, but Ally wasn't. We begged and begged until, finally, she agreed. She counted while Danny and I went to hide. I ran quietly upstairs and into the hallway that had a closet at the end of it. The closet had long dresses in it for fancy occasions. I got in the closet and hid behind a long black dress. I stayed in there for a minute while listening to my cousin count. I heard her yell, "Ready or not, here I come," and start opening doors downstairs. I relaxed in the closet and got comfortable, as I felt like I was going to be there for a while. I couldn't make this next part up, guys. I felt hot breath on my neck. I heard breathing behind me. My first thought was that Danny had beat me to the closet, and I just didn't see her. But then I remembered that I saw Danny duck into the kitchen, which is in the opposite direction that the stairs are. And then I also realized that my back was against the wall. It is impossible for someone to be behind me. Right as realization hit, I screamed and threw myself out of the closet. I landed on my back, facing the closet, terrified. I heard Ally running up the stairs, concerned. I turned to look at her, and she asked me what was wrong. Then I saw the color drain from her face. Confused, I turned around and saw nothing. I turned back around to my cousin, and this which goes, "I found you." "Ah, yes, you found me, that's what's important." She picked me up and shut the closet door before taking me back downstairs, where Danny was peeking from behind the couch, confused. I said I didn't want to play anymore, so we stopped playing. I didn't sleep well that night. A few years later, at age 13, I was alone with her at a family party at a different house when I decided to ask her what it was that she saw that day. Now that I am older, I know she saw something, and I wanted to know what it was. She sat me down and explained her side of it. She said she got done counting and started wandering around, opening doors downstairs, when she heard a scream and a thud coming from upstairs. She ran up those stairs to see me on the floor, a few feet away from the closet door. She said when she asked me if I was okay and I turned to look at her, she saw a head peek out from behind the wall next to the closet door. It had no face and started waving at her. But when I turned back around, it quickly moved out of sight. When she told me that I really wished, I didn't ask. Her and Danny said they both experienced things in that house that were creepy like that. This past summer, I got a lot closer with Danny, as she is 8 years older than me, and we are both emo and depressed. I asked her if she had ever seen a ghost, and thus she told me. She said one time she was playing The Sims on an old computer one night in the computer room. The screen went black due to loading, and I was waiting. While looking at her screen, she noticed what looked like a little boy peeking out from behind the couch. She spun around, and there was nothing there. She said she didn't sleep well that night. I grew up in the church, very skeptical of ghost stories. A friend I worked with told me about a visitor he has had his entire life. This coworker was honest, soft-spoken, and didn't cause any drama. All that to say, he always seemed really honest during the 4 years I worked with him. What he described, I later learned, is a shadow person, but he didn't call it that. He just described this man with a tall hat who would stand over him or at the foot of his bed since he was a kid. Sometimes he had a wrinkled face, but often just a black, cold shadow. Sleep paralysis accompanied these visits too. I wrote it off as a weird dream. I had a few sleep paralysis situations growing up, and I knew the panic of not being able to breathe or move. It's awful and terrifying, but explainable. Well, he starts dating a new girl, and about a year into their relationship, we're out having drinks, and she talks about seeing the shadow man recently while spending the night at my coworker's house. She was also paralyzed in bed. Sometimes there was a large, grotesque woman with him, angry and whispering really fast gibberish. I never knew what to do with this story. This was about 15 years ago, but the part that really creeped me out further. 1 year ago, I worked in people's homes as an installer and noticed a smudge stick and feather. The homeowners had a home blessing recently. I asked about the sage, and the wife started telling stories. Brand new house, new neighborhood, and they are having plates smashed in their kitchen in the middle of the night. She says she doesn't know how much you want to hear. I say, tell me everything. I think it's interesting. She goes on to describe the same shadow figure my coworker described years ago. She felt like this thing had been following her entire life. She thought that moving would change things, but this presence has been with her entire life. Both this woman and my coworker were both born in the same Asian country and moved to the States as kids. Yes, we covered a lot of ground quickly, but I get the feeling most people don't want to listen. I remember her husband saying, I bet you regret asking about the sage now. Haha. I don't know if it's like an old spirit or entity or what, but this story is something I have a hard time finding a category for in my somewhat reasonable life.